So good morning. We are now having a panel on Ibn Taymiyya. We'll make sure that we'll keep you awake. The subject of the panel is on Ibn Taymiyya's impact on Mamluk religion and society. And the first speaker is Jon Hoover from the University of Nottingham, Ibn Taymiyya's impact on early 14th century Mamlūk Ashʿarism.
Okay, thank you, Caterina. Is it on?
No. Is it on? Yeah.
Good. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging our chair's article in 2013 called The Missing Link. It's a call for people like me to come to conferences like this, if I may say so. So I work mainly as an intellectual historian, even more properly an historian of ideas. And Caterina's article in 2013 calls for conversation between intellectual historians and cultural historians, social historians, political historians, because there's this question of doctrine, theology in the Mamluk times, which has a deep impact on social relations and political relations. And there's a missing link in my title, Ibn Taymiyya's impact on early 14th century Mamlūk Ashʿarism, and the missing link is the people, or the commoners. And you'll see that come out as I read the paper. In 1298, Ibn Taymiyya was attacked for describing God as a body or jism in a fatwa called al-Hamawiyya al-Kubra. And the Hamawiyya fatwa examines the interpretation of scriptural texts such as the All-Merciful sat on the throne, and these texts imply corporeal and spatial attributes for God. Then in 1306, the charge of corporealism or tajsim emerged again when the Mamluk viceroy in Damascus subjected Ibn Taymiyya to 3 hearings before the leading religious scholars of the day. These hearings were inconclusive, and so Ibn Taymiyya was summoned to the Mamluk capital Cairo for a hearing that convicted him of corporealism or tajsim. He was then immediately imprisoned and subjected to further hearings in Egypt before returning to Damascus in 1313. These events have been studied through the chronicles and Ibn Taymiyya's own reports, but no attention has been given to the theological writings of his opponents. And this paper will examine 3 of those opponents, 3 theologians contemporary to Ibn Taymiyya, who responded to interpretive issues that are at the core of his Hamawiyya fatwa. The writings of these theologians will show that Ibn Taymiyya's views on God's attributes had a direct impact on the Mamluk Ashʿarism of the day. Ibn Taymiyya's teachings disturbed the beliefs of the common people to such an extent that it stirred those of Ash'ari conviction to articulate and refine their Ash'ari doctrine to meet the challenge. The best known of the 3 opponents I'm going to discuss today, there are actually more, at least one more, but just focus on these 3 for the sake of time. The best known is the Shafi'i jurist Badruddin ibn Jama'a, and the names of the other 2 are Ibn Jahbal al-Kilabi and Safiyyuddin al-Hindi, and I will introduce these at greater length a little bit further into the paper. Here it suffices to say that they all share what I'm calling the post-classical Ash'ari rule of interpretation, or the Qanun al-Ta'wil, and this was articulated by al-Ghazali and Fakhruddin al-Razi in somewhat different versions in the preceding centuries. Now, this rule has 2 steps. First, reason dictates that God cannot have a body or exist in space or in a location. Al-Ghazali and Fakhruddin al-Razi give arguments to this effect. And so, God must be freed of any meaning or ma'na in revealed text which connotes corporeal or spatial qualities. In the second step, there are 2 options, the second step of the Qanun al-Ta'wil. One option is tafweed. Tafweed is to refrain from further interpretation of the text after denying corporeality and then delegate the meaning to God. It is to deny that God has a body and then simply be quiet, not say anything more. This is often called the way of the early Muslims, the Salaf. The second option, ta'wil, is to reinterpret the text non-literally to mean something other than its plain or dhahir sense. For example, God sitting on the throne, istiwa al-arsh, may be reinterpreted as God's sovereignty. Ta'wil is often called the way of the later theologians or the Khalaf, And as we'll see, all three Mamluk theologians, or Mamluk scholars to be examined here, agree that God does not have a body, but then they take slightly different approaches to this complex of tafweed, ta'wil, and the salaf, as they, I'm arguing, try to ward off the threat posed by Ibn Taymiyya. But first I want to give a little attention to the Hamawiyya fatwa. Ibn Taymiyya's Hamawiyya attacks mainly Fakhruddin Ar-Razi and Ar-Razi's version of the rule of reinterpretation. Ar-Razi prefers ta'wil, but he permits the tafweed of the salaf. When stating his rule of reinterpretation, Ar-Razi does not consider the possibility that some of the salaf themselves may have investigated the meanings of the divine attributes. And so, in response, Ibn Taymiyya attacks Ar-Razi for making the salaf out to be ignorant of God's attributes, and the later theologians to be the more knowledgeable ones. The salaf are rendered ignorant because, according to Ibn Taymiyya, Ar-Razi makes them out to believe only in the verbal forms of God's attributes, but to know nothing of the meanings of the attributes. This means that the later theologians are more knowledgeable because they allegedly know both the meanings of the verbal forms and the reinterpretations to which they must be diverted. Ibn Taymiyya rejects this as absurd, and he retorts that the salaf do certainly know the meanings of the divine attributes. They do not merely delegate the meanings to God. So Ibn Taymiyya himself, his own interpretive approach in Hamawiyya, is to investigate the meanings or the ma'ani of God's attributes described in the Quran and the Sunnah. However, he also denies that God's attributes bear any likeness to the attributes of creatures, and he avoids specifying their modality or kaifiyya. And with this, he seeks to hold together a seemingly paradoxical conviction that God is completely different and beyond human experience on the one hand, and yet that God's attributes do signify something real and meaningful in human language on the other. And this leads to some interesting results. In Hamawiyya, Ibn Taymiyya affirms that God is above all things, fawq, he's above all things, and that God sits on the throne in the plain senses, yet in a way unique and befitting of God's majesty. To Ibn Taymiyya, it is of no consequence that such attributes imply location or corporeality, because all of God's attributes are completely unique. Yet, the meanings remain, and they must be understood according to their plain senses established by context. So, Ibn Taymiyya affirms that God in reality is above the throne, yet he also affirms, as the Quran says, that God is with us wherever we are. To Kalam theologians, God cannot be with us at the same time that he is above the throne. And this obviously illustrates to the Kalam theologians the need for ta'wil, for reinterpretation. But Ibn Taymiyya sees no contradiction. The word with, or ma, in this case, cannot imply spatial proximity, God being, next to us, because God obviously is up there on the throne. So instead, according to Ibn Taymiyya, the word with must indicate God's knowledge of our affairs, and this is the plain sense of the text, and ta'wil is not necessary. So let's go to the three Ash'ari theologians. First one, Ibn Jahbal al-Kilabi. He was a Damascene Shafi'i, and Ibn Jahbal penned a direct refutation of Ibn Taymiyya's Hamawiyya fatwa. This is copied into Taj ad-Din al-Subki's Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya al-Kubra. Subki does not identify Ibn Jahbal as an Ash'ari explicitly, nor do other biographical sources. However, as will become clear, Ibn Jahbal's treatise takes inspiration from al-Ghazali, and it lies firmly within the post-classical Ash'ari rule of reinterpretation, the Qanun al-Ta'wil. Ibn Jahbal explains his own theological position most fully at the end of his refutation, and there at the end, we find that he takes al-Ghazali's last work, Il-Jam' il-Awam, as his starting point, and Ibn Jahbal abridges al-Ghazali's work in al-Ghazali's long first chapter of Il-Jam' into just a few pages, so it's a summary of the Il-Jam'. So for both al-Ghazali and Ibn Jahbal, the line dividing those who abstain from ta'wil of God's attributes and, on the other hand, those who engage in ta'wil falls not between the Salaf and the later theologians, as in Fakhruddin Ar-Razi's case, but between the common people and the enlightened elite. The common people must limit themselves to tafweed, Ta'wil is forbidden to the common people. The enlightened elite, on the other hand, engage in ta'wil, but they may not share it openly with the commoners. Ibn Jahbal takes offense at Ibn Taymiyyah's charge that the Kalam theologians render the Salaf ignorant, but he himself evades the accusation. He instead maintains that the Prophet and some of the Salaf did know the true meanings of God's attributes, but they didn't share them with the commoners because, of course, the commoners couldn't take it. The commoners themselves must free God of all corporeal and spatial conceptions, and then they must remain silent and stop thinking about God's attributes. They must not inquire into the meanings of God's attributes, even though they must believe that the Prophet knew those meanings. The Ghazalian tenor of Ibn Jahbal's theology, found in the latter part of his refutation, permeates his criticism of Ibn Taymiyya's Hamawiyya in the earlier part. Ibn Jahbal rejects Ibn Taymiyyah's claim that God is above the throne and the sky literally because this ascribes location to God. The Prophet did not teach that, and certainly not to the common people, nor did the companions and the successors ever teach it to the masses because they were concerned to preserve the welfare of the masses. The Salaf were silent on the matter, and echoing the elitism of al-Ghazali, Ibn Jahbal adds that no one will ever find him commanding the common people to delve into such matters either. Now, when it comes to his own practice, Ibn Jahbal interprets or reinterprets the sense of God sitting on the throne. So he engages in ta'wil for himself. Since God is not a body, Ibn Jahbal reasons, God's sitting points instead to his greatness, his power, and his authority, and his sovereignty. Ibn Jahbal also takes issue with Ibn Taymiyyah's claim that the plain sense of God's being with us wherever we are is God's knowledge, and Ibn Taymiyyah's claim that this is not in fact ta'wil. Ibn Jahbal counters that if Ibn Taymiyyah can interpret with as knowledge, then he has no reason not to reinterpret God's aboveness as rank, as dominion, as sovereignty, instead of spatial location. Ibn Jahbal dismisses Ibn Taymiyyah's interpretations as irrational and censures him for inconsistency. If God's being with us is interpreted non-literally as God's knowledge, then God's sitting must be interpreted non-literally as well. Ibn Taymiyyah, according to Ibn Jahbal, cannot interpret one non-literally and not the other. So for Ibn Jahbal, Ibn Taymiyyah not only disturbs the commoners with his attribution of a location to God, he's also inconsistent in his interpretive practice. So that brings us to Safiyyuddin al-Hindi. Tajuddin al-Subki calls al-Hindi the leading Kalam theologian of Damascus in his time, and al-Hindi also debated Ibn Taymiyyah. We have records of Ibn Taymiyyah and al-Hindi debating, particularly at the Second Damascus trial in 1306. Al-Hindi wrote a Kalam manual called the Tis'iniyya in response to, quote, the famous disturbance, unquote, between the Hanbalis and the Orthodox in Syria. Al-Hindi does not mention Ibn Taymiyyah explicitly, but I think it's reasonable to conjecture that that's who he really meant. Al-Hindi's Tis'iniyya is a straightforward manual of Ash'ari Kalam in the tradition of Fakhruddin al-Razi, and he adopts al-Razi's approach to the post-classical Ash'ari rule of reinterpretation, except at 2 points. First, he takes the more conservative position of preferring tafweed over ta'wil. That is, you deny corporeality of God, and then you stop thinking about God's attributes. You delegate the meaning to God. Second, al-Hindi does not state that tafweed is a doctrine of the Salaf without qualification, as we find in al-Razi. Rather, he says that tafweed is a doctrine of most of the Salaf, and I've bolded most, akthar, of the Salaf. Al-Hindi's ascription of tafweed only to most of the Salaf indirectly envisages some scholars among the Salaf practicing ta'wil. This very subtly undermines Ibn Taymiyyah's polemic against the Ash'ari rule of reinterpretation for rendering the Salaf entirely ignorant of the meaning of God's attributes. Al-Hindi does not tell us why he limits tafweed only to most of the Salaf, whether it's to oppose Ibn Taymiyyah or whether it's for some other reason, but in effect, in making this qualification, al-Hindi joins Ibn Jahbal in affirming that some of the Salaf practice ta'wil, even if perhaps he might not have quite intended that. That brings us then to the third figure, Ibn Jama'a, and he, of course, is a Shafi'i chief Qadi of Egypt, and I'm referring now to his book, Idah al-Dalil. It's actually a short treatise. It's not qualified as a book. Ibn Jama'a's clear purpose in Idah is to combat those who ascribe bodily attributes to God, tajseem. He complains that, quote, some later Hanbalis, unquote, had too much influence among the common people. The exact date and circumstances of Idah are not known, but it is certainly possible that Ibn Jama'a wrote it to counter Ibn Taymiyya. The two had direct contact, they exchanged letters, they met each other personally when Ibn Taymiyya was in Egypt. Ibn Jama'a's Idah is a manual of ta'wil, and he provides 5 arguments for engaging in it. I've put these on the screen. Why people should engage in ta'wil. First, leaving the meaning of God's attributes unclarified leaves room for doubt and idle speculation that would not befit God. Second, it is better to fill people's hearts with some kind of meaning rather than none. Otherwise, they are left open to doubt. Third, inquiring after the truth when one is able to do so is better than remaining in ignorance. And fourth, silence may suffice for the believer, but it will not suffice to correct the unbeliever and the corporealist. Fifth, silence contradicts numerous statements in the Qur'an itself that claim that the Qur'an, is clear. To Ibn Jama'a, it would be of no use for God to address people in terms they do not understand. Unlike Ibn Jahbal, who reserves ta'wil for the elite, and Safiya Din al-Hindi, who prefers the tafweed of the Salaf, Ibn Jama'a seeks to spread ta'wil to everyone, both scholars and commoners, in order to combat the Hanbalis and most likely Ibn Taymiyya. So an example of Ibn Jama'a's interpretation, he reinterprets God sitting on the throne as possessing, istila, and vanquishing, qahr, in order to rule out any thought of body, space, place, movement, and temporal origination in God. He also reinterprets God's withness or ma'iyya in verses like God is with you wherever you are in the Qur'an. The ma'iyya refers to God's knowledge and power. And what is noteworthy here is that he grounds this interpretation in the Salaf, and he wrote, so I give this quotation on the screen. Ibn Jama'a writes, "It is necessary to reinterpret it," that is the God sitting on the throne and this business of God's being with us wherever we are. It's necessary to reinterpret it with what has been transmitted by the Imams from the Salaf, from Ibn Abbas and others, which is what is intended is the witness of knowledge and power, not place, not of place. Sufyan al-Thawri said his knowledge, ad-Dahhak said his power and his authority. Ibn Jama'a does sometimes speak of the silence of the Salaf on God's attributes, and he permits this position. However, it is apparent that from his interpretation of God's witness or ma'iyya that he does not take the Salaf to be silent in their entirety. So to sum up, we have here fundamentally different interpretive strategies that divide Ibn Taymiyya and his Mamluk Ash'ari opponents. In his Hamawiyya, Ibn Taymiyya approaches all of God's attributes in the Qur'an and the Hadith literature from 2 perspectives. From the perspective of linguistic meaning or ma'na, Ibn Taymiyya claims to uphold the plain or dhahir senses of the revealed text, and he understands these plain senses to secure God's distinction from the world by locating God above the sky and above the throne. From the perspective of modality or kaifiyya, the second perspective, Ibn Taymiyya insists that all of God's attributes are unique and bear no resemblance to the corresponding attributes of creatures whatsoever. There is no need to distinguish between attributes that imply body and spatial location of God and those that do not. By way of contrast, the 3 Mamluk Ash'aris examined here do distinguish between these 2 kinds of attributes, and they adopt the post-classical Ash'ari rule of reinterpretation. This rule explicitly denies all connotations of corporeality and spatial extension in God. Beyond this, the meanings of attributes subject to such connotations may be delegated to God, that's a position of tafweed, or the meanings may be reinterpreted, ta'wil, to indicate something deemed non-spatial and incorporeal, such as God's knowledge or power. Despite the incommensurability of their interpretive frameworks, Ibn Taymiyya appears to have influenced the development of early Mamluk Ash'arism in a small way. First, both Ibn Jahbal and Ibn Jama'a state explicitly that concern for the belief of the commoners prodded them to write. Al-Hindi also traces his motivation for writing to a disturbance caused by Hanbalis. Ibn Jahbal addresses Ibn Taymiyya directly, and the other two probably had Ibn Taymiyya in mind. It is thus apparent that Ibn Taymiyya's influence among the commoners provoked the emergence of this Ash'ari opposition literature. The challenge posed by Ibn Taymiyya also led to a certain refinement in Ash'ari theology. Ibn Jahbal, al-Hindi, and Ibn Jama'a share the core incorporealist presupposition of the post-classical Ash'ari rule of reinterpretation. However, they all depart from Fakhruddin al-Razi's unqualified attribution of tafweed to the Salaf. Ibn Taymiyya attacks al-Razi and Hamawiyya for making the Salaf out to be ignorant of the meanings of God's attributes when al-Razi adheres to tafweed. Ibn Jahbal responds directly to Ibn Taymiyya's criticism by highlighting the practice of ta'wil among the Salaf. Additionally, Ibn Jama'a appeals to the practice of ta'wil among the Salaf during his interpretive work, and al-Hindi acknowledges it indirectly. None of our three early Mamluk Ash'aris ascribe tafweed to the Salaf without qualification, and I suggest the pressure of Ibn Taymiyya's polemic probably deserves the credit for this. Beyond the commonality among these three Ash'aris, they took different positions on ta'wil. Safi ad-Din al-Hindi prefers tafweed over ta'wil, but he permits ta'wil. Ibn Jahbal adopts a Ghazalian approach that distinguishes the enlightened elite from the common people. The elite, from the Prophet down to Ibn Jahbal himself, they may engage in ta'wil, but the commoners have to be prevented from doing so. Ibn Jama'a, I think, provides the most interesting case. He provides a vigorous program of ta'wil as he aims to counter the influence of Hanbali corporealism among the masses. With Ibn Jama'a, there is no reserve about sharing ta'wil with ordinary people. It is indeed best to fill the minds of everyone with correct notions of God to ward off doubt, ignorance, and idle speculation. It seems likely that Ibn Jama'a had concluded that this ta'wil was necessary for the masses because that was the only effective recourse against the influence of Ibn Taymiyya. Thank you.